Okay, so I think we're recording now. And this is our first summer book club of 2020. 2020, the amazing year of all kinds of fun. But we're doing a book club, and I think it was Joel who said, like, let's please have a theme that has nothing to do with pandemics or disease. Let's have something nice like food and agriculture, something along those lines, which very good idea. I support that. That's really, and so that's our theme for the summer is the food and agriculture. And our first book is this wonderful book called Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Wall Kimmerer. And I really enjoyed this book, so I'm looking forward to discussing it. But I want to start out with some introductions. So my name is Laura Williams. I'm an assistant professor of biology at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. And this is the 6th summer book club that I have hosted. So that's pretty awesome. Very excited about that. A couple people have been doing this for a while, so I might just throw it to, because she's right next to me, Nicole. Nicole, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely, thank you, Laura. So I'm Nicole Suctio, and I was working in the agricultural tech industry. Now I am officially between jobs and constantly looking at calendars to remind myself what month we're in, because that's the kind of year we're in. And I might be shifting back to teaching in the short term, which I'm looking forward to. So that's a bit about me.
Thank you very much. And then I actually see, I'm going to go to Karen next, because Karen is joining us again. So if you guys might or might not know that Karen was in fact a original member of the Micro JC way back when it was a journal club. And so Karen has been involved from the very beginning, and then she kind of had some things that she wanted to do, and she's back for the first time, which I'm really excited about. So Karen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Well, hi everyone. I'm Karen Lowe. I'm a sessional assistant professor now at Trinity Western University in Vancouver, BC, Canada. I was with Laura at the very beginning when we first started this journal club / book club, and in, what was it? It's got to be 2012, 2013, something like that. It was a long time ago. But I finished my PhD and then needed some time to recover. So I'm happy to be back and engaging again, and I really enjoyed this book as well. So I'm happy to be with everyone, and I think we'll have a wonderful discussion.
Yeah, we're really glad to see you again, Karen. And then I've got next to me is Joel. Do you want to introduce yourself, Joel?
Sure, yeah. It's been a while since I've joined in on one of these book clubs. Looks like I've lost my hair, and Laura, Nicole, and Karen haven't aged a day. But anyway, I'm in Montana. I teach at Montana Technological University, or Montana Tech for short. But anyway, I'm looking forward to this book. I bought it several years ago, got into maybe 3-4 hours into the audiobook, and appreciate the chance to go back and actually re-evaluate, re-listen to it. Anyway, good to be here. Thanks, Laura.
Of course, it's good to see you. And then I've got Lucy. Lucy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Lucy Mccauley. I've been doing the book club, I think, for 3 years now. I think this is my 3rd year. And I've had lots of fun along the way. Actually, I think the last time we had book club, I was defending my dissertation like in a week. So I passed. And so I'm now doing my postdoc in the BAME lab at Harvard Medical School. And I also really enjoyed this book. I only got about I think a little more than halfway, but it's great. I can't wait for the discussion.
Yeah, Lucy, I think you got in touch with me at one point to ask what we were reading for the first book, and I think that you had a week. So I'm amazed that you got halfway through. That's pretty good, because I thought, oh, you got a week to read this. I'm so sorry. But you did really well with it then. And then I see Jess. Jess, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jess Lowry. I'm coming from Kelowna, BC, Canada. And I mainly am on the learning services side of things. I work in a library mainly with grad students. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about this book. I didn't get that far in, but life kind of happened, but I do plan to continue reading it for sure. Thanks.
Yeah, and I will just say for anybody who's here now or anybody who happens to watch this, you really don't have to read the whole thing. This is not homework. You know, we welcome people to come if they've gotten part of the way into it. That's okay. That's all good for us. And I see Megan, who I think this is your first time joining us. We're very excited. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yes, it is my first time. I am a library science student at UW-Madison going into my second year master's degree. I kind of study independently on my own food and agriculture, indigenous foodways and African American foodways, primarily looking at Gullah Geechee culture in the coastal Southeast. And I originally, I read about a third of this book maybe 4 years ago. I read the entire book about a year ago for an Indigenous seed sovereignty class, which Robin came to and was able to present to us. So that was a really unique opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we'll be very keen to hear your thoughts on this for sure. And last but not least, is Joan, and I might have to unmute you because I was getting a little background. So let me unmute you. And oh, there we go. Did you get it?
Yep.
Aha. Yes. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Joan, Laura's mother, but also a person in my own right. And I'm retired and have been quarantining since the middle of March. So pretty much around my house and going to the doctor and spending time in my yard. And I'm so happy I'm still in my house and can go out into the yard. And I listen to the audiobook, which is very easy for me to do because I listen to books while I fold laundry, do dishes, and simple cooking, and even started to listen to it a second time. And she was a very good speaker. Yes, the audiobook is amazing.
Yeah, I think Joel, did you describe it as like calming or soothing? I didn't get to listen to it. Is it like a nice kind of calming, soothing?
I think I said it was like listening to an elder. I grew up pretty close to some Native American reservations, and so had quite a few contacts, and they always just seemed so wise to me that I appreciated listening to her.
Yeah. So with that, with a kind of having introductions done, we can now kind of get into the book. I'll start out by saying, and it's so funny because I think this is one of the primary lessons of the book, is it's a collection of essays, and it probably took me 2 or 3 essays before I kind of allowed myself to read the book like I think you're supposed to read the book, because I started it kind of like, what am I supposed to learn? Like what are the facts? Like, where are the facts about like food and things? And what am I supposed to know about sweetgrass? And here we go, let's learn things, let's science. And I think I did exactly what she talks about in at least one of the essays about kind of just, you know, got to get something out of this, you know, and it took me probably 30, 40 pages before I realized that that's not how you're supposed to read this book, that you're supposed to read this book as like information, but also poetry, and also thanks and recognition. And you're really supposed to, I kind of learned some of the lessons she talked about in the book as I was reading the book. And I was kind of thinking, oh, okay, this is exactly what she's talking about, is this transactional nature of trying to read this book, and I need to get away from that.
Laura, you shouldn't feel bad about taking 30 to 40 pages, because I'm thinking I took about 8 hours or so before I'm like, why am I waiting around to memorize the science facts that she's throwing out? Anyway, it's funny. I'm glad to hear someone else was a little slow too.
Oh, and that's exactly what I was going to kind of ask as an opening question is do people think that was that people's experience? I see Megan's kind of mentioned in the chat that you jumped around a lot. Like, Megan, did you kind of selectively read things?
No, so that was when I was reading it for class specifically. And one of the problems I wrote earlier up, because I was listening to the audiobook exclusively originally, is that I fell asleep every time I was listening to it, because it was like this beautiful lulling bedtime story. So I approached it in the like antithesis of how you approached it, which was like, it really was this kind of folktale for me from like moment one. And that's why I fell in love with it. The way that these kind of science and storytelling and memoir are woven together to create their own braid throughout this book is really amazing to me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it was delivered really beautifully. I now really wish I'd gotten the audiobook, because it sounds like such a wonderful experience to listen to. Other thoughts from folks on just kind of how you approached this, or how your approach might have changed as you started listening to it or reading it?
I'm gonna
Oh,
go.
sorry, Nicole.
Okay, so I'm just going to say that I had to fight the urge to rewind every time the science got dropped, because I just felt like, oh, that's what I should be paying attention to. And then I realized, no, you're supposed to be paying attention to the fact that the science is dropped, but there's a much more compelling narrative here for ecological complexity and why the science actually makes, you know, the awareness that people have of this complexity by being in place is actually as grand or greater. So
Yeah, Karen, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say that I felt that when I was reading it, I didn't feel that I could go from chapter to chapter. Like, after I finished a chapter, I felt like, oh, I need to sit down and reflect on this idea and let it gradually sink in. And so every time that I was reading a chapter, I admittedly also only got through half of the book, just because there were so many ideas that were compelling and that I needed to sit with and reflect before I felt like I could move on to the next idea. Like, they would sit heavily, and I'm not sure if it's just because in the COVID era there's so much going on that I'm overly emotional about certain things, but it felt like I needed to sit and reflect and process through it before I moved on to the next story. And so it took me a really long time to read.
I think that both, we all want to respond to that. I think what
I had a very similar experience to that.
What you guys all said is kind of why I had to jump around when I was reading it for class, because like Nicole, I just actually, like I said, I would fall asleep and I would just restart it over and over again because I felt like I didn't get enough out of it. So that was my way of sitting with it rather than like sitting in silence. I actually sat in the repetition of her words and the repetition of her storytelling, and like every single time a new thing stood out to me.
I was just going to say that, Laura, you said that there's an essay that kind of hit you over the head with it. And I'm wondering if you're referring to the one where she took the med students or pre-med students out to the mountains and like just hammered them with data, and that they never really got what she had intended for them to get out of it. That was at the point in the book where I finally figured it out.
Yeah, I think that one was one of them, and there were a couple of them. There were a couple of points that it became clear that this is what she was trying to get across. But yeah, I had the same experience as Karen, which it sounds like other people did too. You know, books that we've read in the past that are very kind of have a broad thesis that move from chapter to chapter. I can sit down. I'll be like, okay, I'm gonna devote like an hour or 2 hours, and I'll just through pages and pages. And with this, I would finish an essay, and even if it was a short one, exactly the same thing. I would be like, oh, I can't just go to the next one. There's like a big point there. Like, I should sit here and think about what that big point was. And so it took me so much longer to kind of, which was great, you know, because it wasn't just get to the end of the book and figure out how you know, how many pieces of data we have to discuss. It was really about, you know, finding the message and kind of internalizing the message, which I think was very powerfully done here. But I just want to, I'm going to pick on Joan for a second, because you did mention something to me when we were chatting over the phone, that you said that the hardcore science stuff kind of went past you, but you felt like this was accessible on the other side of things, right?
Oh, definitely. I thought she was a very good storyteller and a very good writer, and she wove together her background in heritage science and her own life very well. I really enjoyed it. And then the part you were talking about with taking the pre-med students, now she ended that with saying that they started singing Amazing Grace when they were coming back. So she felt like she touched them as much as she could possibly touch them. So I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, I agree.
I think the storytelling, oh, sorry about that.
No, please.
I think the storytelling part for me too was what really drew me in, and kind of the different connections that she's making. And to me as well, it felt like it was like each story was this separate thing that you kind of had to read. And then I pretty much got through like a story a day. And then, yeah, so I found that I had trouble just kind of putting one down and going on to the next one.
Yeah, even a couple chapters into the book, I was like, I need to just buy this and leave it on my coffee table so that I can just pick up a random essay at any time that I like walk by and just like sit down with that for a little while. There were even some chapters where I like, I made my partner sit down and like listen to me read certain parts of it, because it was just like the storytelling and the things that are being told in the book were just so amazing. It was just like so well told, and like the things that are said are so interesting and stuff.
Yeah, and I thought it was sad too, how she interwove the stories about the way Indians were treated too in the country as people came from Europe. That she started with that sadness, but she has such optimism.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the things, and this is kind of one of the things I was going to mention, is I really respect the skill that it takes as a writer, and I guess the compassion that this you have as a person, that you couldn't pick this book up and nothing in here is accusatory. So there's nothing in here that if you read it, you would go, oh, I was just trying to make me feel bad about all these things, these ways that we're going wrong. She's trying to, like, she's pointing a finger at me about I'm not doing this right and I'm not doing that right and I'm a bad person. Which I think, as we're talking about things like sustainability, as we're talking about ecological restoration, we talk about what can we do about climate change. And she does mention this towards the end in an essay about how people process bad news about the environment and the planet. I think there is a tendency for people to get very defensive, and for people to interpret things as, you know, I'm being accused of being a bad person because I either participate in this economy or I don't call these things out. And I think one of her great gifts is an ability to, I think it would be impossible to pick up this book and not feel like you are being brought in as part of a larger community who share a set of goals and a set of hopes for the world, and the way that people can bring themselves back into a more reciprocal relationship with the world. And I think that's an incredible gift. And I imagine it comes through in her science as well. I don't know
I
if
think she
anybody,
was
I don't know if
able
that, yeah, please go ahead. I just said that and then it
to
was like, please talk.
kind of embody the sense of reciprocity that she's repeating throughout the book to her readers. And she's so compassionate, right? And she is an educator, so she's educating her reader in that really kind of, I can hold your hand, I'm okay with that kind of way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Megan. It's deeply, like the book, the way it's worded is deeply relational, because it doesn't just bring you into, it brings you into connection with her because she's telling you these personal stories, but that narrative is also, that narrative facilitates connection, but as it facilitates connection, it opens me up to being taught and to actually hear what she wants to say. So it's a beautiful way of also thinking about education, where as educators we build relationships, but by building that relationship, that also helps facilitate the material that we want to convey, or at least teach others as well. So I think both Megan and Laura also touched on those points.
Which that's interesting, because when you're talking about being educators, she specifically tells a story about the one research student she had, and they wanted to do the sweetgrass based upon the women that did the weaving, and how they said that the committee was not very receptive to that project. And then it was, yeah, I thought those things were interesting. Her comments on presenting a thesis idea to people that have been in education for a long time, and how they view the nature as a commodity instead of a relationship with it. I thought that was an interesting story.
I completely agree with that. I was actually, well done, Joan, because I was going to bring that up, because there are a couple places where you can see, like, places where she's gentle about it, but it's the idea that the edifice of science, especially Western science, falls, and I don't think she ever says this directly, but I think you could say this. The whole idea of the Carlisle School was to try to remove Native heritage and Native culture from Native American people and kind of make them integrated into what we thought was the proper way to have a society. And she talks about that, but Western science does the very same thing, where we try to strip all of these soft ideas from science, from ecology. You know, she mentions at one point how her students, the idea that their study organisms could be beautiful, that like the plant that they want to study is beautiful, gets like driven out of them. Like they should be embarrassed to say that in a committee, and she expresses a lot of regret. And I agree. I think that's an unfortunate tendency of the sciences, is in order to try to be taken seriously, we try to pull away from anything that embraces something that might, you know, things that are not quantifiable, you know, reciprocity with your environment, or just admiration and love of your study organism. We're kind of told, don't do that. That's not real science. That's all murky and so forth. And I think she's right in pointing out that it's wrong to separate those things, that you have to allow people to retain some kind of joy about what it is that they want to spend their lives studying and why they want to study it.
Laura, I'll jump in. I don't know how many times I've been working on a research project and I made some sort of observation that I thought was great, and I'd be ready to publish it and share what I found, and only to, you know, have my mentors rein me in and say, you know, you don't have a mechanism yet. It's not worth anything unless you know what the mechanism is. And anyway, that's what came to my mind when that one dean was given the grad student a really hard time. Even when she presented her final defense, he was still wanting mechanism and couldn't see the value of her research.
I'm going to jump in here because there's some really, like, this is just an awesome set of topics that we've fallen on, and I'm going to be the terrible person who makes a pandemic-related statement, which is just that, like, we are now faced with a disease and trials for drugs that we know pharmacology for other things. So mechanism isn't actually helping us advance anything right now. We're looking for solutions without necessarily knowing all of that chemical connectivity. We're looking for ways to alleviate suffering. We're looking for ways to increase lifespan. I was trained as a biochemist, and I also am trained in a health studies degree where, of course, they say that the ultimate understanding of sort of a pharmacological or even, you know, a lifestyle-based intervention for a disease, the thing that will pin it most, you know, precisely to being an effective treatment is the plausible biological mechanism. And sometimes you get that, sometimes you don't. Does it really matter? Does it really matter if these relationships play out over and over again? Does it really matter in this case of like the pecans, where you have those years where the entire population decides to generate seed? I mean, you've got these regulatory cycles that are just so interwoven that we just don't really understand, but they are real. So, and I think it's also interesting that we've talked about the whole emotional involvement. I mean, people do end up, it hasn't happened to me yet, but I did have a trainee who got emotionally attached to the bacteria they were working on during their associate's diploma. So languages of animacy are a thing. We slip into them. We don't use them in the states of reverence that, say, indigenous peoples do, but like, it's a very human way of creating that relationship. And no one can be blamed for using the lens of what we are, which is humans, to kind of interpret the world around us. And I think in Robin Wall Kimmerer's writing, she encourages that, because her narratives of what's happening in a forest or what's happening with the cattail, they're very connected to descriptions that you can relate to as descriptions of human bodies or descriptions of interactions that we know as social. I mean, we even talk about social behavior in bacteria, kind of. So we're always co-opting from having no choice but being human.
I'm going to jump in here since Nicole brought up the language of animacy, and I have a very interesting story about this because I was reading that chapter as I stood in line at a Asian grocery store for BC spot prawns. And so there's a very short season for spot prawns in BC. They're about this big, they're very colorful, and they taste very good. And so when these BC spot prawns had gone on sale, and so I got up at 9 in the morning, drove to the grocery store, and then found that I was standing in line for about 30 minutes along with a bunch of other people to get these prawns. But then as she spoke, as I was reading her words about the language of animacy, and then suddenly being surrounded by the economy and commodification of all of the living organisms around me, like I'm standing in the seafood section where these prawns and the fish, they could have stories to tell. We could have things that I could have learned from them. They have lived lives somewhere else. And but I'm reading this book and I'm standing in line and buying prawns, and there was just this dichotomy that was both depressing but beautiful at the same time, and I almost cried, and I'm like, oh, what do I do with these feelings? I don't know what I'm doing. Anyway, I just thought it was that was just the poignancy of and the epiphany that I had in that moment. But it was just, it's a testament to how powerful her narratives were, but just that reflection of, yes, we've commodified living things, and people consume them as if they don't have a second thought. Another story that I have about this is I went to the aquarium with my mom, and I would, when as a child, I would be like, oh, Mom, look at this beautiful fish. And my mom would be, oh, that's good steamed. That's good fried. That's good. And I was like, oh, Mom, you're missing the point. But now I understand that there's this difference in the way that she was perceiving it versus the way that I was perceiving it. And I was seeing that same reflection of me standing in the grocery store and buying these fronds. And anyway, I think that's the end of what I wanted to say.
That was fantastic, Karen. That was great. This is why we're so glad that Karen's back. That was fantastic. I totally agree with you. This is not going to be nearly as good as your story, Karen, because your story was great. But I had a similar kind of realization. There's a route that like a 4-mile route that I've been walking because I don't go anywhere else but in my house, and then I walk this route. And I've been walking it for, I don't even know, almost daily since like March to get outside. And I just read some of her book, and I'm like, I'm gonna go out for a walk. And I was walking along, and there's this stretch that's really on this busy street, and it's my least favorite stretch of the walk. I just kind of try to get through it because there's cars going by, and it's just kind of not a fun, pleasant part of it. But there was this tree that was growing up kind of sort of in somebody's yard, but most of the tree was over the street and the sidewalk, and it had dropped all of its berries. And all of its berries had just landed on the sidewalk in the street, and they'd just been crushed by all these people walking by. And I was like, oh, but that's like a gift from this tree, and it's just getting smashed and like left in this concrete. That's so terrible. And I like stopped for a minute because I thought, I've never thought about this before, but the way she presents these as, these living creatures, I love that she calls them plant people, like human people and plant people. Like plant people are giving gifts to us that we're just ignoring, that we're just not paying any attention to whatsoever. Either we completely ignore them, or in Karen's wonderful example about the seafood, we just commodify it to the point that we've lost all perspective on the relationship of reciprocity. And yeah, I don't know that I would have ever thought that without having read this and just the powerful way in which she kind of presents that. And I've read stuff on sustainable development and being ecologically conscious, but this is a really different mindset than a lot of that, I think.
If that tree would not be on a busy street, the birds would have been eating those berries. So
right.
The tree would have given it to the birds, but it's too busy a street.
Right, the birds didn't have a chance before the berries got all smashed.
Right.
I'm sure some microbes enjoyed it.
I hope so. I hope so. I did want to mention too, we talked about kind of the idea that bringing this idea of kind of relationships and reciprocity back into our science. I am just going to mention this because if things go as planned, who knows, but next spring I should be teaching symbiosis again. So I teach symbiosis occasionally, and I have already resolved that I'm going to have them read the chapter on lichens, because we spend an entire class session on lichens, and I read that chapter on lichens and I thought, this is so beautiful. This is the most beautiful description of lichens. They're going to read it. I'm going to make them read it, and they're going to roll their eyes, and we're going to talk about why it's important that they have to read this chapter, because it helps you appreciate how incredible that relationship and that symbiosis is. So I've already got that marked down, that we're going to do that in symbiosis, which is good. Oh, Nicole, yeah, the Three Sisters chapter.
Yep.
So that one is a good one too. Any other, that might be, Mom, somebody calling you?
Yeah. It's on the landline.
I know there's some folks that are doing teaching. Did anything kind of come out of this as things that you might use for teaching related purposes?
I think kind of, oh, sorry, Nicole. I think kind of Karen spoke to it earlier, but I'd be interested in thinking more about like the connections that she's making in terms of like all those facts that we had talked about at the beginning that we were trying to focus in on, and the fact that she's built a whole story around these things. And that's the important part. That's the part that we remember. I think I'm going to have to do a lot more reflecting on that, but yeah, essentially not the facts that we remember, but the whole framework of the story and everything else that kind of goes with it. I think is just excellent scientific communication. So.
Okay, so the chapter where she was with the med students and like basically, aside from the fact that she failed by dropping too much data on the heads of the students, the whole dialogue that was fostered by considering the entire function of the cattail as a resource context, like that kind of question and answer, and that kind of framing a conversation around what do humans need, how does this plant fulfill it? I actually really like that as an idea of getting students to do more inquiry-based learning. Like we could do that in microbiology when we talk about interactions. We could do that when we talk about, you know, culture and growth requirements for different things. I mean, it's such a great conversational tool to show people, you know, that those biologies are real. The whole basket weaving chapter, thinking about sort of tensile strengths of materials and how residual organic matter is useful to us. I mean, these are great ways of linking the chemistry. There's some very beautiful stories in here where you can also expand it out to talk about molecular things or ecological things. And I think she's given us a great example of how to do a dialogue of inquiry, even if it's not necessarily based in a field trip, but also showing us all these different ways of thinking about plants and what they do, like all the examples of plants in water where she talks about the parenchyma and the buoyancy and how they're getting their oxygen because their feet are in the water. I mean, they're great stories, and they're so well put together by her that I would definitely use those as readings to sort of draw people in and then move to the textbook to further go into that. But having an engaging mental model that way is just fabulous.
I'll chime in. Sometimes I have to teach classes for majors and I feel like I need to get through the material really fast. But other times I teach non-majors, biology 101, 102, and the goal there has always been just to have fun. But I think that I could bring something like this discussion into those classes where there isn't a set goal or like a time limit that I feel like I'm up against. Maybe I should try to make time for it in my other classes too. But anyway, then today I'm starting to teach for 5 weeks. I teach some high school students every summer, and we have to teach by Zoom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have them, we're going to do ecological landscape design. And I was kind of coming at it from a permaculture point of view because that's what I've been reading about for several years. And then I realized this whole TEK, as Nicole calls it, is permaculture. Anyway, I'll talk about giving gifts back to nature. Like if we like birds, then we should do something in our yard that would help make birds happy, or something like that.
I just thought of this. I hadn't actually thought of it while I was reading the book, but these ideas nicely integrate to another teaching method that I heard of from a conference, which was this professor was sending his students out on community service trips, but then in these community service trips also asking the students to see how cell biology could be woven into their service. So for example, like the best example he gave is a student going to volunteer at a nursing home, but then she developed this relationship with with one of the elderly residents, but then this elderly resident passed away. So she wrote a note about her experience, but then also wrote about the cell biology of death. So then essentially asking the students to do exactly what the author has done here, which is interweaving their knowledge of the science along with the personal stories, and then in that way developing a personal connection to the material so that they're learning it as well. So just like an essay piece or an assignment based on a personal experience, I think would be really useful as well.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. I think that having them make those connections makes things land more solidly, and it sticks better, because it's not just things from a textbook, cycles they're memorizing, arrows going this way or that way. You know, they actually think about how does this happen when it's out in nature, when it's out in its regular setting. And I think it's interesting too, because it takes a shift in thinking. And I was just going to note that this past spring, I was in what's called an interdisciplinary faculty seminar at Providence College. So it was just like 6 or 7 of us, and the theme of it was sustainability. And so we were all talking about how our research or our interests might connect with sustainability. And so one of the things that we did was we read a book at the beginning called, it was called Flourishing, and it was about a different view of sustainability. So the idea was more, it was kind of a dialogue between 2 scholars in this field. And it was interesting because it kind of presented a different view of sustainability. They tried to move away from like sustainable development, and they were trying to kind of get people to adopt an idea that what we really need is a culture of flourishing. People need to kind of have that mindset. And I remember getting to the end of it and finding it kind of a little bit hollow. You know, I liked the idea that they were trying to push us away from, you know, that sustainable development still means, you know, consumption and production at this steady level. I liked that. But this idea, I never thought that the idea of flourishing really landed. And when I was reading this, I thought, well, I think that's why it didn't land, because their whole concept of flourishing was still very inwardly focused. It was like, me as a person, I am going to find these ways to flourish. I'm going to figure out how to fulfill like what my real purposes are. And it had very little discussion about kind of what the major theme is here, which is that human beings are part of a very large ecological web, and that there are cultures that have embraced that and incorporated that and taught that. And the whole idea that human beings are the youth on the planet and we're supposed to be learning from everything else around us was just entirely missing from that whole discussion about flourishing that I had read. And I thought, that's the missing piece. The missing piece is that they've tried to kind of construct this humanist way of moving forward, but they've refused to situate people in the world, which is the non-human world. That piece was just not there at all. And I read this and I thought, I wish I'd had this like 3-4 months ago when we started that seminar, because I would have suggested this as a counterpoint immediately, because I think it provides that missing perspective. It was really interesting to read it so quickly after having participated in that. And so I don't know if you guys have thoughts about more broadly how this intersects with the movements towards sustainability and sustainable development and so forth.
I do think you need to think about how you present the information or present the idea. For example, I gave a seminar last fall to a restoration seminar series, and I was talking about how soil gets built up over time with organic matter and all this. But I cited a few times this regenerative agriculture website, and they used language that, where I'm from, it would have been considered kind of hippie-ish. I'm from eastern Montana. All the people there are ranchers, and they manage the land, and they do not want to hear anything that's even sounds a little bit sort of progressive, sadly. But the way that I brought it up in my seminar, that what they might respond to is the Boy Scout ethic of leave it better than you found it. And so that's my idea for trying to approach people that might not be ready for hearing about nature in the way that Robin Wall Kimmerer very nicely discusses nature.
Yeah, it is probably a journey for a lot of people, and people start at different places. So I could certainly see that. Any other thoughts on how this might intersect with kind of sustainable development type movements?
So I do recall that, I don't know the chapter, but Robin Wall Kimmerer does make the point that settlers cannot be indigenous to place in a place that they've settled in. That's a fairly straightforward statement. And what she does suggest is the having to invent or develop your own concept of relationship to land. What is it that you find value in? Now, of course, there's problems with that if you're doing it through a capitalist lens, which we all do in the economies we live in. We all learn how to see through that lens. Having to take the responsibility to understand that the world before industry was all we see. I don't know if everyone can be convinced that those regulatory cycles are powerful, but I think having to work hard to find it personally is probably that call to responsibility. I think some of us have sort of developed that relationship through studying science in this discussion group, and some of us have done it by other ways. But I think that she's very gentle in suggesting that it's a very individual thing. I don't know, which means that I am failing at telling you how to use this as a way of mobilizing, but taking the responsibility to understand why you live where you live and what you want to do to make it better to live where you live is probably the gateway to being more altruistic about it. That's all I really have to say about that.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I'm thank you for bringing up that the point that she made about how you cannot become indigenous to a place. I think that was a good. It was a good point. It was a good conversation, and again, I'm so impressed by her ability to say things that are very clear, but she's very gentle about it. So it's not as if you finish that. I mean, because I am a person with European heritage, so I didn't finish that passage and think, oh, she's just insulted me. Like I finished that passage and thought, yep, that's true. But there's still a way forward. It's not exclusion. It's just understanding and then figuring out where you sit in all of these relationships, which I think is a really good way to do it. I'm just glancing at the clock, so I try to keep this to an hour because I want to respect people's time. Do folks have any closing thoughts you'd like to share about this that we maybe didn't cover? I wanted to give people an opportunity to share any closing thoughts.
I actually have a question for everyone. Did anybody, after reading some of these chapters, really get the urge to like start a garden? or just like have more of a relationship with your backyard or anything like that. Because I
Yes.
especially after the Three Sisters chapter, I was like, I need to do this. It's like it was a very interesting chapter, but it just really made me want to like be more involved in my garden.
So for that chapter, I was out mowing my lawn, but I was listening to it. Last year I bought a reel mower, which is the kind that you just push along and mechanically just the wheels turning make the scissor-like action on the front, just so I could listen to audiobooks while I mow my lawn. But anyway, it felt right to be listening to that story while I was out working in my yard.
I think in 2011, I volunteered on a Japanese organic farm for about 2 weeks, and I was really one of the happiest times of my life, like because life was so simple. I got up, I worked for the food that I was going to eat, and we ate the food, and then I went to sleep, and I did the same thing over again. And reading this book just really brought me back to that simple time of being simply connected with nature in this reciprocity cycle. And it just brought those comforting feelings back, and I was like, oh, I really miss that, because I haven't grown anything for quite some time, so I really wanted to get back into it too.
I'm gonna pick on Joan a little bit because I know you're doing stuff in the yard. Did you have any thoughts about your yard work as you were reading this?
I'm not growing anything that I can eat. I'm just out there trying to stay ahead of weeds, which I don't know. I think that they are the invaders. I don't think they were indigenous. So, but yeah, I think it's very comforting to be outside and working with your landscaping and so on, and the grass. Yes, I very much enjoy that. I enjoy the sounds when you're outside too. So like the manual lawnmower, you can actually hear the birds, and there's a couple of woodpeckers in our neighborhood, and I always think that's very relaxing and comforting when you're outside.
Yeah, I finished that chapter where she where she talked about how her huge effort to restore that pond on her property in New York State. And I thought, man, I wish I had a pond to restore, which is the most absurd thing ever. I would definitely not have any prayer of doing that. But I like finished that chapter and thought, how can I get a pond? You know, which my husband found hilarious. He's like, I'm not gonna do that. What are you talking about? But that just shows you how kind of inspiring I think all of her writing is. So I'll try to keep my house plants alive. That's what I'm going to try to do. Well, it's the baby steps. It's baby steps.
You could try to find a pond on campus property, and then create a project for ecology students to try to restore that pond, while also looking at the protists and all the algae that grow in the pond. Anyway.
That's exactly what we should do. We've got like bioswales on campus that do stormwater runoff. So that's a project. That's a good one. Okay, so I try to keep us to an hour because I want to make sure, don't want to run across the people's time. I do want to mention, because Megan has put a couple of really awesome things for recommendations into the chat. Megan, did you want to just, I could mention them, but do you want to just mention these couple things you've recommended?
Sure. As far as personhood of plants, there's a book on it called Plants as Persons. I have not read the whole entire thing, but I recommend it. And I just put a little link to some of Robin's writing that maybe you could share with your students, so that it's just there, it's immediate. You don't need to photocopy anything. You don't need to worry about having them get a book. It's really similar to what's in the book. And that's it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I'm intrigued by the plants as persons, so I will definitely go looking for that, because that's a really neat idea that I'd like to kind of learn more about, read more about. Okay, so I really want to thank everybody for what was just a fantastic discussion for our first discussion of the summer. I really appreciate everybody taking time to do this. I am going to, we've got the other 2 books selected for the rest of the summer. So the second book that we'll be reading is called Seeds of Science, and it's about genetically modified organisms. That information is posted for the book is posted to our website. So I think you guys have all seen it, but in case anybody gets this far and is watching it, if you get this far and you're watching it, you should just come to the discussion because you should just join. So that's the second book. And we will be doing that discussion in July. I'm thinking probably late July to give people enough time to read it. If you guys have days or times that do or don't work, we can try to keep it around this time, but I know that things can shift around. So if you want to join if you want to join next month's discussion, and this time is not good for you, like Mondays in the afternoon, please get in touch with me because I want to make it as accessible as possible. But I will try to post this up on the website. Is there any other closing thoughts that anybody wants to share?
I should read this book.
Definitely. We definitely recommend reading this book. It was a great book. It was a great suggestion. And I just thank you guys for all being here. It was really lovely. This is a nice way to start the third official day of summer. It's a perfect book for it. So hopefully we will see you all in July for our second discussion. And until then, everybody take care, especially these days. And we hope to see you next month.